All right, so we are in Genesis 29, and if you want to go ahead and turn there, we in our 2 weeks ago we were looking at chapters 28 or 27, 28. Of course, this is the things going on between Jacob and Esau, and as we get into 28, Esau is ushered away so that he can get away from his brother's fury. And so he's sent to Laban in Mesopotamia. So as we get through that chapter, he arrives there in chapter 29. We also have Esau in 28 marrying an Ishmaelite. We covered that. And we also talked about Jacob's dream with the ladder ascending to heaven. So, as we get into 29, we get into a kind of a soap opera, if you will. It's a very interesting narrative, but it with a lot of deceit in it. And so, we've already seen that with Jacob. He's practiced deceit himself, and he's going to be deceived. So let's go to that text 29. We talked about the first part of this text. I won't cover that again, but you will remember he's traveling through the land there. He's arrived there. He meets Rachel. She's coming out to feed the flocks or their water. He actually removes the stone from the well, and she's able to drink from it. Let's go to verse 13. This will kind of give us a transition point as we move forward. So let's just read it together and we'll talk about it. So verse 13. As soon as Laban heard the news about Jacob, his sister's son, he ran to meet him and embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his house. Jacob told Laban all these things, and Laban said to him, "Surely you are my bone and my flesh." And he stayed with him a month. All right, so he arrives at the house of Laban. Now, who is Laban? We met him previously. Who is he? He's Rebekah's brother. He's the nephew of Abraham. He was there when the servant of Abraham had come and had gotten Rachel and taken her back to Isaac. And so now we have Jacob coming into his household. He's excited to see him and welcomes him in. It says, the text says he stayed there a month, so just keep that time frame in mind. Now, when Rebekah had sent Jacob away, what was her expectation about how long he'd be gone? It seems like a very short period of time. Well, we're going to find out that's not what happens. It's much longer than probably what she or Jacob had considered. So he's there a month, and then Laban comes to Jacob in verse 15. He says, "Because you are my kinsman, should you not therefore serve me for nothing?" So what do you know right away? What's implied in that question? He's been working for a month. And Laban has taken note of his work ethic, that it's enough to come to him and to offer him some kind of deal. And so he says, "Tell me, what shall your wages be?" Now Laban had 2 daughters, verse 16. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were weak, interesting phrase, but Rachel was beautiful in form and appearance. So let's talk a little bit about this. I was talking to Lisa about this before. So when you look at the term Leah, I don't know how to say this just to say it, but in the Hebrew, it's a little bit of a complicated name, and it has 2 possible meanings. one meaning is a gazelle, right? You think about a beautiful gazelle going through the African wilderness, right? The other one is fat cow. And so I will choose to believe it's a gazelle. All right, that's what I'm picturing in my head. When they named her, that was the thought they had. And it's also interesting, the Bible describes her in a particular way, not in the most flattering way, but interesting because it's a little bit mysterious, isn't it? At least, I'm sure in the day it was written, people then would have understood what this meant, but this is not a phrase we use often. It says, her eyes were weak or soft. Now, what does that mean? Well, the only way for me to be able to define that is to look at its counterpart, right? And so that in some ways, the writer's defining it based upon Rachel. Okay, so he's setting up a comparison, isn't he? So he says, Leah's weak in the eyes, or soft, but Rachel was what? Beautiful in, notice this, two ways, in form and appearance. So, I don't know exactly what it means to be her eyes being weak or soft, but I know it's not like Rachel, right? She's not beautiful in appearance or form. Okay, so two very different sisters. And we also find out that Leah is the older and Rachel is the younger. And so Jacob has, because he has such an attraction for Rachel, has come to ask for Rachel's hand for the marriage pact to be made. And is Jacob clear? Is he clear about what he wants?
Yes.
He is, right? He asked for the younger. He's very definitive. Well, what's the trickster Laban at work? The text says that Jacob loved Rachel, and he said, I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter, Rachel. And Jacob is not, there's no ambiguity about it. He's asking for Rachel. Laban, however, and then Laban responds, he said, it is better that I give her to you than that I should give her to any other man. Stay with me. And so essentially he agrees to the pact. Now, one other thing, this is very different than our custom today. This is not the way marriage is handled today. But we don't live during this time. We live during a different time. And during that time, and there's still cultures that do this, the father, the patriarch, had control. And any child under him, he had a measure of control over them, especially with the young women and who they would marry. And so this was common for them to marry, or to perform these kind of pacts with one another. So they make an agreement. He says, I'll work for 7 years. That's a long time. 7 years. Think about where you were 7 years ago and look at where you are today. A lot's happened in 7 years, hasn't it?
Yes.
And it seems like the younger you are, the more happens in those kinds of periods of time. And so 7 years is a big commitment. And so he agrees to do that. And so verse 20 just kind of covers a long period of time in a short statement. It says, so Jacob served 7 years for Rachel. And then you get this kind of romantic, he throws in this kind of romantic statement about Jacob. And the years, seemed to him but a few days. What woman wouldn't love to have that written about them from their husband, right? Because of the love he had for her. And so he worked that diligently All with what expectation? I'm going to marry Rachel. And I assume maybe he thought, I'll go back home then. But I'm going to do this. Now, in the case of Rebekah, none of this was a part of it, right? She was just given to Isaac, or to the servant to take to Isaac. There wasn't all of this involved. But that gives Laban what? 7 years to build his scheme. Okay, does he have a scheme? Let's go to verse 21. Verse 21, Jacob comes to Laban. He says, give me my wife that I may go into her, for my time is completed. So they've been kind of in an engagement period for 7 years. And now it's time for that marriage pact to come to completion. So Laban gathered together all the people of the place and made a feast. Everything seems all right, right? Laban's doing what he's supposed to do. But in the evening, he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and he went into her. Now, the into her, of course, is the consummation of the physical relationship. Now, I know probably what's going through your head. In all of that time, how did he not know this is not the same lady? And I'll be honest with you, it doesn't tell us. We know one thing, though. The next morning, he is upset. So there are a couple of options here for why he didn't know. The dress of the day, the bride would be veiled. I don't know the whole procedure of custom of how long that veil would have to stay on. But I know he consummates with her. So she is his wife.
The Bible points out the difference in eyes.
But it also points out there's a difference in form and appearance, like otherwise. But he doesn't note that, right?
There had to be something to do with what happened at the feast.
So the other option is, and this may be true, is that he had simply become intoxicated.
Because it says it was all men.
Yeah, and that's quite possible. He was just out of it. I've never experienced anything like that, but you hear people talk about it. I guess you can get to where you just don't really know what's going on. But that's a possible explanation. I do think Jacob's response is sincere. Like he's not trying to then pull one on over, like he knew it the whole time, and then he's like, has regret in the morning. I don't think that's it. So let's go back. Okay, verse 25. Verse 24, I just want to say this. Laban gave his female servant Zilpah to his daughter Leah to be her servant. It's kind of just like a footnote that the writer is putting in there so that we'll know that. And that'll be important in a little bit. So, in the morning, verse 25, behold, it was Leah. And I love how at least the English translators here in the ESV put an exclamation point on it. Right? He got up, and this is not Rachel. And so, keep losing my place. And Jacob said to Laban, what is this you have done to me? Did I not serve with you for Rachel? Why then have you deceived me? Now that's all true. Jacob's got to be careful though. He used deception, didn't he, to get the birthright, the inheritance, the birthright from his brother. But he has been deceived. It's quite clear. I think Laban probably had this in his mind the whole time. I'm sure he knew how much Jacob loved Rachel. So Laban answers in verse 26, It is not so done in our country, to give the younger before the firstborn. Now, to my knowledge, you continue to do your research, there's no custom that we know of that time where the older had to be married before the younger. Now, it's convenient for Laban, but as far as I know, historically, I'm not sure this was true. But whether or not it was true, it's happened, right? It's kind of done at this point.
It's pretty frowned upon though, if you like had a daughter that did not get married. And
So it was definitely frowned upon to be, yeah.
And so this was maybe things like, well, nobody's, wanted Leah yet. She's older, so this is my way of getting her married.
And maybe that's his thing. He's being deceived. Well, even if that was the custom, what he should have done was at the front. I know you want Rachel, but I've got to marry Leah first. So he had deception in his heart from the beginning. He knew what he was going, or at least at some point he knew what he would do. And so then he devised, he so conveniently has a plan. All right, we're going to make this right. Verse 27. Complete the week of this one, talking about the marriage feast, right? Those marriage feasts would last for a week. And we will give you the other also in return for serving me another 7 years. So I just want to clarify that, just so we're all clear. So he worked for 7 years, then was married to Leah. They had the marriage feast for a week. At the completion of that marriage feast, he was then married to Rachel before serving the 7 years. And then he would have another marriage feast, and then he then would be indentured to serve another 7 years. Okay, so that's kind of the way it works. So he did have Rachel for the extra 7 he worked. He had 2 wives. And that'll be important to note because in those 7 years, what's going to happen? He's going to have children, all right? And so we'll note that in a little bit. So anyway, okay, verse 28. Jacob did so and completed her week. Then Laban gave his daughter Rachel to be his wife. Laban gave his female servant Bilhah to his daughter Rachel to be her servant. That was customary of wealthy families. You'd have a maidservant usually, and they would be there to serve the wife. So she was not a wife of Jacob, though, not technically. That changes. But here at the beginning, she's not a wife. She's a servant of Rachel, just as what her name just leave me. Zilpah is a servant of Leah. All right, so Jacob went in to Rachel also, and he loved Rachel more than Leah, poor Leah, and served Laban for another 7 years. So I don't know who to be mad at, right? I'm definitely mad at Laban. He's deceitful, and he treated his daughters, I think, very poorly. He gave her to a man that didn't really love her. And I can sympathize definitely with Jacob in a way because he loved Rachel. That's who he thought he was going to get. It's a little hard for me to be real hard at Jacob. But no matter what had they done? They violated God's law of marriage. He had more than one wife. He's breaking the law of marriage that was set forth at the beginning. So that's a violation of God's intended cause. But no, it's happened before. I mean, we've had Abraham, right? Now, Isaac kind of gets removed from all this. He didn't get involved in any of this stuff. But we did see Abraham a little bit. His situation is a little different. He didn't have 2 first wives. He had a wife, and what would be considered probably a concubine, which is kind of like a second tier wife. But one of the interesting things I think it's important to note is the degradation of sin. And I want to talk about that a little bit more in just a minute. But one of the things reading through Genesis that I come back to is you see how each succeeding generation, the sin grows a little bit. Go back, Abraham lying about Sarai being his sister. We see that grow with Isaac and Rachel. Well, we also saw the sin with Sarai and Hagar being offered to Abraham, right? But then when we get here, it grows even more, doesn't it, with Bilhah and Zilpah. All right, so let's talk about the sons. Got a bunch of them. All right, let's read through this and we'll talk about it. So, when the Lord saw that Leah was hated, now the word there, hated is probably the wrong word. This is probably where people get talking about Leah being unloved. That's the ideal here. Not hated, but really the idea of unloved. That's really important when we get here. Okay? We'll see this play out with the children. Okay? Lord saw that Leah was hated or unloved. He opened her womb. Again, notice the ideal there. God is behind what? By bearing the seed, right? By conceiving children. God is involved in that process. That continues to this day. Right? God is the birth of a new life, the conception of a new life. God is there. And so Leah conceived and bore a son. She called his name Reuben, for she said, because the Lord has looked upon my affliction, for now my husband will love me. So we see her first child, Reuben, right? And what does it mean? A son. Now what's I'm sorry, I'm writing small. I don't have a whole lot of space, but that says a son. You can get out your magnifying glass. But what's the significance of that? Firstborn son. There's a couple really significant things. Number one, we can't forget that Rachel's barren to this point. There's a special significance to the fact that, number one, Leah is able to bear children. That's important. Number two, that it's a son. Why is a son significant to their culture? Legacy. Legacy. He continues our family legacy. A son. And then he's firstborn, which goes to some other significant things like inheritance and birthright. But he's a son. God gave me a son. Okay, Reuben.
Find out when it comes to the law too, because the law specifically says if you have a wife that's loved and a wife that's unloved, you can't give the legacy, the rights of the firstborn can't be given to the son of the loved woman over the son of the unloved woman. So if the son of the unloved woman is first, that one still gets the inheritance.
Oh, absolutely. That's a good point. Yes.
So Reuben being unloved Leah, he is now destined before the law to get the inheritance.
Now, this gets tricky later, doesn't it? Because they lose, these three guys all lose it. But west down the road, we're going to save that. But that's significant. And so this kind of sets a precedent for what we see in the law of Moses, and what you're talking about. All right, so verse 33, she conceived again and bore a son. What was his name? Simeon. Simeon, right? The text says, because the Lord has heard that I am hated. Notice that again, a continuing theme. I'm hated. He's given me this son also. She called his name Simeon. What does Simeon mean? Heard. Who heard her? Actually, well, there is that definite instance God heard her. And she says, God responded to my hate. I think there's two essence to this. Who else is she hoping will hear her? Her husband. Will he note me now? Will he regard me. I've given him a son. Will I now be heard? She wants to be noted and appreciated. She's looking for appreciation from her husband. So she has Simeon. Verse 34, she conceived, and bore a son, and said, now this time my husband, this is why I think a lot of this is directed toward him. My husband will what? Be attached. That's the English Standard. Anybody have a different term? Now my husband will be joined, right? Attached to me. She wants that connection with him, an emotional connection. How many wives in this room want an emotional connection with your husband? How many don't want that? Right. You want an emotional connection with your spouse or your partner, and that's what she's longing for. Because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore, his name is called Levi. Anybody know what Levi means? I bet you can guess it. Attached, right, or joined. All right, attached. All right. She's not done yet. God's going to bless her again, isn't he? All right, so go to verse 35. She conceived again and bore a son, and said, this time I will praise the Lord. Therefore she called his name Judah. Then she ceased bearing. What does Judah mean, do you think? Praise. Her heart is full at this point, seemingly least in regard to her children. What we don't get is the interplay between her and Jacob. That's kind of left out of all this. So we're actually getting more of the story through the naming of her children than we even are of the narrative. You notice as it continues. All right, you got Leah. She's had 4 sons now. There's so much I want to say about Judah. This is really significant. One, I have to say this. So Judah is significant. Why? Well, number one, the birthright falls to him eventually. We'll see that through the book of Genesis. Because these 3 lose it. What else is significant about Judah?
He's in the line of Jesus.
Jesus. Where did I come up with that? Jesus is his descendant. He is the heir of the promise. Judah, the son of Leah. The son of Leah is the heir of the promise, not Rachel. Now Rachel has a really good son, Joseph. I love Joseph. But it's Judah who's the heir of the promise. Leah. Leah's son is the heir of the promise. I think that's kind of significant. Let me go real quick. I know I'm out of time. When Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she envied her sister. That's kind of a significant term, isn't it? That's one of the commandments. We'll find out later in the law of Moses. We can't envy. Covet. She said to Jacob, give me children, or I shall die. Now I shall die, that's an emotional statement. But Jacob going to be able to give her children? He's not the one opening and closing the spout on children, is he? That's God. But she's desperate, isn't she? When we get to be desperate, be careful. Desperate people do make poor choices sometimes. Oftentimes.
Value a woman back in that culture.
Mm-hmm.
Her value was providing, especially providing children for her husband, especially sons. I mean, were basically considered useless providing children. You know?
Absolutely.
You can see her self-esteem was pretty well hurt when, she had nothing.
And so, exactly. And so in verse 2, Jacob doesn't respond really well to this, does he? Verse 2, Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, am I in the place of God? Well, he's actually asking the right question. Who has withheld from you the fruit of your womb? And probably he's desperate too. He has no answers for her. What husband doesn't want to answer your wife's questions? Sometimes we want to answer too quickly. But he has no answer. And so he's left to wonder as well. And so then she devises a plan. I better stop here. I'm out of time. We have a lot to go through. But that at least gets us through the first 4 children. Now, we'll go to Bilhah, and we'll see what God does through Bilhah, and then we'll finish this out. But the tenor, and don't let me forget this, the tenor of emotion, you'll notice the change. I think there's some real kind of something almost praiseworthy about what she's going through, right? We can all like shake our head and say, she needs to be heard. She needs to be loved. Things change, and it becomes something else. And it's interesting how it plays out through their names. All right, we'll go ahead and dismiss.